Sylvie, thank you and congratulations and thanks to the organisers. Now, as you all know, power corrupts, but PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. And on that basis, I'm not going to use it. I'm going to give you a rest from the PowerPoint this morning. Now, my focus is actually on Russia, but very specifically on the context of the conflict and the responses to the conflict in the North Caucasus, by which I mean Chechnya, Dagestan, the neighbouring republics. And as I'm sure you'll be, at least perhaps distantly aware, that region has been subjected to repeated and systemic egregious human rights violations in recent years committed by law enforcement agencies and agents in the context of the fight against armed groups, in the context of the anti-terrorism struggle, as it's put there. The context is also one of a climate really of impunity. The failure of the rule of law to respond to these violations and the lack of independence of the judiciary in Russia broadly, but also in this region, and a criminal justice system that's thoroughly imbued with prosecutorial bias. The acquittal rate in Russia is something like 0.7, 0.8%. That's not 7 or 8, it's 0.7, 0.8%. And that's across Russia. It's a system which is really designed to hand out guilty verdicts, and that's the experience in the North Caucasus, where, of course, we have the president of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, since 2007 has been himself implicated in these violations. His paramilitary group, the Kadyrovtsi, have been implicated. There are cases in Strasbourg on this, and as reported by human rights organisations like Amnesty and others. So there have been a series of very serious violations of extrajudicial executions, of enforced disappearances, of cases of torture, of killings through the use of aerial and artillery bombardment in that region. And I think I'm here today because of my involvement in ERAC, the European Human Rights Advocacy Centre, which is a centre that we've established and has been operating for 10 years or so now, working with NGOs and lawyers from that region. And we work with Memorial in relation to the North Caucasus, one of the main human rights NGOs in Russia. And just going back to what Kieran said, Memorial isn't lawyer-led. As Kieran was commenting, those who set up Memorial come from the sort of dissident tradition of Russia. They are chemists and physicists and so on. It's not lawyer-led. But we've been working with Memorial for 10 years. We've taken something like 300 cases, not just from the North Caucasus, but many of those are from the North Caucasus, to the European Court of Human Rights. And there are now more than 200 judgments against Russia in relation to the North Caucasus region, finding substantive and procedural violations of the right to life and prohibition of torture and so on. And most recently, and I think most significantly, the case called Astrokanova last year found that the incidents of disappearances and the failure to investigate were systemic. So this is the European Court developing its slightly more collective approach to these sort of violations. What I want to do today is, in the time I've got, is to paint something of a picture of the nature of the oppression of lawyers in that region. I thought it was very important to give you a little bit of the context. And I do so on the basis of having spoken to a number of lawyers working in the region, who I won't name for obvious reasons, but also I point you to a very good Amnesty International report from earlier this year on this issue called Confronting the Circle of Injustice. And in fact, just yesterday there was a report released by the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe on the judicial system in Russia, which also talks about the position of lawyers and the threats to lawyers in the North Caucasus region. And finally, by way of context, I did want to mention the foreign agents law in Russia. because if we're broadening out the discussion a little bit to talk about human rights defenders, as I think we should, and most speakers have, I think, there is a new law in Russia which targets those who receive foreign funding and who are engaged in, quote, political activity, unquote. This has meant that a whole series of NGOs have been raided, their documents have been taken, they're subject to notices now that they must register as foreign agents, which has the same implications in Russian as it does in English, that you're a spy, and they are being prosecuted, and it will lead and is leading to prosecution and fining, and has led to closure already. One of the leading election monitoring bodies, NGOs, has already been closed. It's an existential threat to NGOs in Russia at the moment. It's one of those critical moments that Kira mentioned earlier, I think. So, with that context drawn for you, what is the nature of oppression of lawyers in the North Caucasus region? And I want to start with the nature of threats that lawyers are receiving, often warnings from law enforcement officers that come indirectly, often through relatives. There are often veiled threats, there are often anonymous texts with threats and insults sent. Not only that, but lawyers are under pressure in relation to their ability to practice, with prosecutors, investigators, and so on, making complaints, making disciplinary complaints to bar associations against lawyers who are allegedly acting unprofessionally or abusively or whatever. There are even cases of pressure on lawyers' relatives. One lawyer from Kabardino-Balkaria, one of the North Caucasus republics, complained about her 17-year-old son being threatened, being held for several hours, being questioned about his mother's work as a lawyer, and that led to him having to leave the region because the family were afraid of his safety. There are direct, and there have been direct death threats. Just 2 or 3 years ago, one of the Dagestani lawyers I met was on a list that had been circulated, list threatening blood vengeance against members of armed groups and their accomplices, which included lawyers, according to this flyer. And then there are individual cases of people receiving death threats. The lawyer Magomed Abubakarov in Chechnya received death threats. He was then later injured in a suspicious car accident involving the police in 2011, and those threats against him have continued. But not only are there direct threats, but there are also indirect threats in the form of pressure placed on lawyers' clients. So certainly applicants to the European Court of Human Rights have been subjected to pressure. They're being asked to abandon their complaints. And they're also asked, well, where do you get your help from? Who's funding you? That's a very common thing we're hearing, implying that the lawyers are going to get into trouble with the authorities for supporting them. There are attempts to influence people's views about their lawyers, so that they then change their strategy or renounce their legal representation. There are also spreading of rumours about lawyers, that certain lawyers are assisting the authorities, in fact. This creates a situation, of course, in which lawyers become very, very worried that if they do anything proactively, they're actually going to worsen the situation for their clients, who maybe, if they're detained, they may be subjected to ill treatment, they may be subjected to harsher sentencing, and so on. And as a result of this, you won't be surprised to hear that some lawyers are stopping doing criminal defence work in the region, some are abandoning their careers altogether. One might step back and ask why it's happening, and I think I go back to the context, the broader context which I talked about at the beginning, and that is very basically because it's happening because what defence lawyers do, it has the effect of restricting or counterbalancing the unlimited powers of the law enforcement bodies in this region. Lawyers are being perceived as obstacles to this process, this system of convicting people. Then there are other means of surveillance and harassment, covert surveillance, phone tapping, searching of lawyers' offices, as we've heard earlier. In some cases, legal proceedings, quite high-profile legal proceedings. There was a slander case brought against Oleg Orlov, one of the leaders of the Memorial NGO, by Ramzan Kadyrov. Oleg Orlov was subject to both civil and criminal defamation proceedings. And then there are, of course, direct attacks on lawyers, and there are more and more of these cases being reported. So just to give you a few examples of that, a lawyer called Sapia Magomedova, another lawyer from Dagestan, was beaten in 2010 at the police station when she was trying to get access to her client. She was hospitalised, and when she did lodge complaints against the police officers involved, she was warned that she should withdraw those complaints, and she was then herself prosecuted. She was prosecuted with violence against an official, prosecuted with insulting a government official. She was subjected to travel restrictions as a result of that, not to leave the Dagestan Republic. And in the end, both sets of cases were closed, both the case against her and also the cases against the police officers. And there have been several other reports of attacks against lawyers in Dagestan in recent years. Another example from the North Ossetia Republic was a lawyer, Irina Kudzayeva, who was assaulted by a criminal investigator. Again, she was trying to seek access to her client, was barred from seeing the client, who was being questioned at the time. She was told that the client had declined her services. Her complaints were not then investigated, and she again, like Sapia, was charged with using violence against a state official. Later, the client said that he'd been tortured and hadn't renounced her services. These are a few examples, but of course it's true to say that most assaults on lawyers are not reported by the lawyers because the lawyers again fear that it would make things worse for their clients and wouldn't achieve anything. We're still in the region. There are cases of disappearances and murder of lawyers. One disappearance case went up to the European Court, the case of Ibrahim Tsurov from Chechnya, who was taken away. He was taken in broad daylight, taken by a group of men into a car in 2003 when he was on his way to a case at a military court in Grozny. The case remains uninvestigated, like the majority of these cases in the region. His family brought a case to the Strasbourg court and was successful, the Strasbourg court finding Russia not only having failed to investigate the case, but also directly responsible for the disappearance, so both a substantive and a procedural violation of the right to life, Article 2, of the European system. And the murder cases. Our colleague and friend Natalia Estemirova, who worked for Memorial, she did many years of work on summons, in some cases on the cases that went to Strasbourg. She was the person who was taking statements from members of families and so on. She herself was abducted near her home in Grozny in 2009, and her body was found later in Ingushetia. Her case is currently pending before the European Court brought by her family. There have been a series of attacks, killings of lawyers in Dagestan in recent years too. One lawyer, Omar Said Magomedov from Makhachkala in Dagestan, was shot in the street in 2012. He was part of a law firm called Caucasus, which had been subject to harassment and threats by law enforcement agents. And then more recently, in July this year, another lawyer, Magomed Guchu-Chaliev, was killed in the same city of Makhachkala in Dagestan near his home. And a case that, one other example, a case that you may have heard of, didn't occur in the North Caucasus region. It was a killing of the lawyer Stanislav Markelov in Moscow in 2009. But Stanislav, the there are links here because he had represented Anna Politkovskaya, the journalist who covered, who'd written an awful lot about violations in Chechnya. And Stanislav was also representing the family of Elza Kungaeva, who was a young Chechen woman who'd been killed by the military in Chechnya. And unusually, in her case, there was a named official, Colonel Yuri Budanov, had been found guilty of her murder, and Stanislav had been involved in that case. So it's rather a litany of different forms of oppression against lawyers in the region. I was reflecting earlier, thinking earlier on how the conflicts that we're discussing today are at different stages. It feels to me as if there's an awful long way to go in Chechnya, because there is still no sign of any political will to investigate these violations. This is one of the constant themes of the Strasbourg judgments, failure to investigate. It's something that the Committee of Ministers in the Council of Europe is pushing, but there's still very little sign of political will to carry out serious investigations. And so I think, although one can draw many parallels with the violations in southeast Turkey, Denise was talking about, this conflict is some years kind of behind the situation that there is in Turkey. And we also face, Chechen lawyers face a similar problem to southeast Turkey, or the problem of statutes of limitation starting to kick in, and therefore it being impossible after a time of there being investigations because there'll be time bar. That's already the case in Chechnya, although there is, like in many instances, there's actually a lack of clarity about the domestic law in Russia, so we don't actually know how the statutes of limitation apply. Just to finish, how much support are lawyers in the North Caucasus region getting? Well, again, it's not a great picture that I'm able to paint. What are the bar associations doing? Well, they're providing very little support, bar associations in the region, and that's because they are linked to and dependent on the authorities. So for the bar associations to act would require the heads of the bar associations to prove their independence and, if you like, their immunity from the intimidation by law enforcement agencies in North Caucasus, which at the moment doesn't seem to be possible. There is very little judicial support because of the context in which I described earlier, in that there is a sort of implicit judicial favour of restrictions on advocates, routine sort of dismissal of advocates' motions, and even a quite an aggressive, hostile rhetoric towards lawyers who are seen to be the obstacles, as I mentioned earlier. But to finish on a slightly brighter note, to mention the support that NGOs are giving, all important support that NGOs are giving to victims of these violations, including the lawyers in the region, both national NGOs and international NGOs. And I also wanted to mention finally the joint mobile group in Chechnya, which was set up in 2009 by a group of human rights defenders from Russian NGOs, essentially, who've created a group to establish a permanent presence in Chechnya of lawyers who will act in these cases. And people go there on a sort of rotational basis. They go there to carry out defence work, and then they move on. I think it's quite an important initiative. In fact, they just won the Martin Ennals Award for Human Rights Defenders this year. That's the joint mobile group in Chechnya. That's all I wanted to say. I look forward to this discussion and reflection that we can have now and this afternoon. Thanks very much indeed.